As those of you who have been frequent participants in the NBER Social Security meeting over the last few summers will know, we have tried to identify a core big issue on which there would be some scope, not for paper presentations as much as for presentations on what we know and what some of the core open issues are. We've talked about mortality prediction, about fertility rates, disability claiming rates. And this year, there was just an obvious topic to convene this discussion around, which is the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic for Social Security and disability. We have 4 panelists this afternoon who will be able to attack this question from different perspectives. Jim Stock, the Harold Hitchings Burbank Professor of Economics at Harvard and a former member of the Council of Economic Advisors, will start off by talking about the current state of the economic impact of the pandemic and what we know about the possible near-term consequences. We'll then turn to the team from the Social Security Administration, Chief Actuary Steve Goss, as well as Deputy Chief Actuary Karen Glenn, who will basically talk with us about the work that's going on at Social Security and their take on a variety of things, the drivers of mortality, near-term returns, and other factors that contribute to the outlook. And finally, Louise Shaner, who's the Robert Kerr Senior Fellow in Economic Studies at Brookings and the Policy Director at the Hutchins Center, and a member of recent technical panels at Social Security, will give her impressions of some of the long-term consequences we should all be focused on.
There's been a lot of research on economic activity and shutdown orders and so forth, and I just want to summarize what that literature says because I think we're at a point of consensus about that. I want to do a quick review of the public health data as of this morning, and I know Steve and Karen are going to say more on that. I want to talk a little bit about the policy dependence of the recovery or the pre-vaccine recovery, and then I want to spend some time looking at the post-vaccine recovery. For a topic like Social Security and economics, one would normally be thinking about a very distant horizon. I think for reasons that I'll make clear, what matters over the next 6 months is of tremendous importance, in my view, for the more distant horizon. Okay, so okay, so I'm not being able to, okay, here we go. Okay, so there's been quite a bit of work, and I've listed some papers here, and this is a partial list. There's been quite a bit of work now on what actually the dynamics on a daily or a weekly basis were during the shutdown and then during some of the reopening periods. And the big question is how much of that shutdown is endogenous and how much of it is exogenous. That is to say, if a government says, oh, all businesses, a governor says all businesses are closed, is that what's driving a shutdown in economic activity? Or alternatively, is it that just people don't want to go to the restaurants if they think you're going to be infected? And by and large, where this literature comes down is on the second one of these points, which is that much of the shutdown, not all of it, but much of the shutdown, self-protective behavior, there's a huge implication of that. And the reopening is also, you can't just open a restaurant and say, oh, great, okay, people will go back. People will only go back when they feel comfortable doing that. And I'll show a couple of pictures to that end. There's a really important implication, which is that you can't simply announce that the economy is going to reopen. You can't simply, say that bars are open or whatever it is. The only way the economy is really going to recover, even in the short run, or get any semblance of normalcy, even in the short run, is by suppression of the virus. So epidemiological policy or public health policy at this point is economic policy. Here's a couple of pictures. The one on the left is just something I pulled down this morning from TSA, looking at the people who go through screening, 7-day moving average. And what's striking about this is, of course, not just the big drop in March and April, which of course everyone knows, but the remarkably slow recovery. So despite all of the economic reopening announcements, despite all the governors or many of the governors lifting restrictions, we are still down at, I don't know, what is this, a quarter of where we were, or maybe even less a year ago. in terms of people actually going on the plane. And if you look at it recently, as there's been this uptick in cases and deaths, it's flattened out over the course of the summer travel season. The picture on the right here is a diffs in diffs type study, which is, this chart happens to be taken from a paper by Chetty and Hendren and Friedman and others. But there's a lot of other papers that make the same point. This is looking at spending, and this is comparing Colorado, which reopened earlier than New Mexico. And you can look at spending in Colorado, and here's the Colorado reopening, and here's the New Mexico reopening. And you can see that basically there's very little difference between these two. It's not what's driving the spending is not whether the businesses are open or closed, but whether people want to go and shop or go to the restaurant. Okay, so that really brings us to the question of what does the data look like right now? I think everybody is aware of this, so I'll be quick, and I know that Steve and Karen are going to say a little bit more. In the Northeast, which was hit early, deaths have been declining. There's been a little uptick in cases. In the rest of the US, cases surged back in June. Deaths have been ticking up consistently. If you look at the different states, Arizona seems to have cases declining now, although deaths which occur with a lag are increasing. Texas continues to have cases increase. Florida might have peaked in terms of cases, but it's not quite clear. But in any event, deaths are continuing to increase in Florida. So some people call this a first wave or a second wave or whatever, but we're hardly, we're still in the midst of this. So what this raises, here's just some data on R effective, on the effective R, and as you can see here, some of these states are still hovering around 1. So Arizona is hovering around 1, Florida is hovering around 1, Massachusetts is hovering around 1. 1 is kind of it's better than 1.2, but it's not where we need to be if what we're really going to be doing is fully suppressing the virus. Okay, this is, so I guess we get to do a little self-promotion. So I'm going to talk about a paper which was a Bureau working paper back in May, and then a new version of that is a Brookings paper coming out that was in the June Brookings conference. And the big picture conclusion from that paper is that the most important, the closures themselves, so simply closing restaurants or simply closing shopping malls, doesn't have enough oomph by itself to really stop a second wave. So here's a simulation of a second wave where people have stopped wearing masks and that sort of thing. What really works for a second wave is increased testing, increased mask wearing, quarantine, self-isolation, small group, restricting large group gatherings outside of work, outside of the workplace and outside of shopping. And it's possible to do that based on our simulations, but that is entirely a matter of policy. And I think the main point here is whether we end the year with 10+% unemployment or whether we end the year with the low, with the mid-single digits unemployment is entirely a matter of what happens with epidemiological policy over the next few months, especially what happens with expansion or not of testing and tracing and protections for the elderly. Okay, so what do we make of this in terms of the forecasts? Here's a couple of forecasts. I'm going to just look at the GDP forecast, the level of GDP, or an indexed level of GDP as produced by the Wall Street Journal Survey of Professional Forecasters, which is nice because it's publicly available every month on about the 10th or 11th of the month. Back in May, the Wall Street Journal forecasters were moderately pessimistic. They saw a V coming out of the second quarter. But then after, into next year, it really looked like the median forecaster was saying that we'd be essentially on the path of GDP during the financial crisis. So I've set this figure up so that this is the GDP path projected by CBO before the pandemic. This is the actual path. I'm sorry. This is the actual path of GDP during the financial crisis, and then this is the Wall Street Journal forecast. based on the May and June employment reports, those forecasters got more optimistic. So they thought that the median one thought that we might almost be back to the pre-pandemic level of GDP by the beginning of 2021, or maybe, if we project this out, maybe the middle of 2021. I personally think that this is overly optimistic. It's also based on the June employment report, and this was done back in June 11th before we saw the most, I'm sorry, this is July 11th, but the forecasts were done, the forecasts were actually done earlier than that. And I think they don't take into, my guess is they don't take into account the full range of the implications of the second round of shutdowns and consumption drawbacks. But anyway, that's just what it is. And I think Steve and Karen will be discussing this further. Okay, I'm going to provide some time series evidence. In the few minutes that remain, I'm going to provide some time series evidence on what I think are the two key features, two key questions here, which is the transition from what I might call fast or V-shaped dynamics to slow dynamics coming out of normal recessions. When do we think that might happen? Under what circumstances might that happen? How do we think that that's going to play out? So how do we think about the post-COVID recession recovery? And then there's a related question, which is this like a completely new world? Is this recession entirely different? And if so, that would actually be pretty optimistic, because we might think that all of the traditional dynamics that we normally see are ones we don't need to pay attention to, and that this recession has just got a new world of fast dynamics and we might come out of this quite quickly. Or alternatively, have the old dynamics or the old co-movements essentially continue to exist in the current crisis, just exacerbated in a huge way. And unfortunately, the preliminary analysis that I'm going to present suggests it's the latter. Okay, so here's slow dynamics. This is what we don't like, and this is where the unemployment rate increases by, between like almost 1 percentage point, decreases by about 1 percentage point per year during the 1980s recovery, by about 0.5 percentage point per year during the next two recoveries, and then during the most recent recovery by about 0.7 percentage point per year. So this sort of slow and steady march of the unemployment rate towards a lower rate, if we find ourselves at the end of year or when we get a vaccine at about a 10 percentage point unemployment rate, just extrapolating this, we'd be looking at a recovery like the financial crisis recovery. And the question is, where are we going to be, and when do we think these slow dynamics are going to take over? So we did some to try to get at the fast and slow dynamics. We've done some time series modeling of weekly series. This is the weekly economic index, which is produced by the New York Fed and the Dallas Fed jointly. And so what we've been able to do is extract a slow moving factor or slow moving component and a fast moving component. The fast moving component accounts for nearly all of the most recent movements, although it is kind of interesting to note that recently the slow moving component, the more persistent, what we might think of as normal business cycle component, does seem to be declining in the weekly economic index. This is unfortunate. We just don't have, I'd sort of hope that by this point we'd have enough information to be able to tease out the slow moving and the fast moving dynamics, and maybe see some of the slow moving, fast moving leak over into the slow moving, and we haven't really been able to do that. One thing I do like is our forecast chart, which shows that there's a pretty wide range of uncertainty in terms of even the weekly index going into the fall, and I actually think that's a reasonable forecast band. Here's a second exercise, and this exercise is looking at monthly co-movements. So this might be a little hard to read. So this is going to be a growth rate of the index of industrial production, and what you can see is that a 5-factor model fit to 80-something series, monthly in series. This has been around for ages. You fit it through 2019. And so given the estimated parameter values, you can compute what the 5 factors would be, and then compute what the predicted values should have been using the old parameter values. And that's a measure of out-of-sample stability of the old factor model for the new dynamics. And what's striking about this figure is that you see that those old factors completely explain the movements in industrial production. Now that's kind of, maybe that's not surprising. And if you have 5 factors, you ought to be able to get 5 series exactly right. Maybe this is just one of them. This is the picture for retail sales, and you can see that that really matches also. This is the figure for payroll employment. You can see that that, again, really nails it. So the big macro aggregates are co-moving in a way that is remarkably consistent with historical business cycle patterns. Much bigger, much faster, but the same co-movements. Okay, so that maybe is neither here nor there, because we know the shocks are different and maybe they'll die away. Here's the scary part for me, which is we start looking at durations of unemployment. You can see that duration of unemployment, that is the number of people unemployed for 5 to 14 weeks, has the same dynamics in this recession as in previous recessions. So it actually went down, the growth rate actually, it declined a little bit, not as fast. Well, that's because of people sleeping over from 14 in the most recent employment report, the June employment report, seeping over from 14 weeks into 15 to 26 weeks. If you look at the 15 to 26 weeks, you'll see that there's that increase, and it's the same co-movements with these big aggregates. And if you look at 27 weeks plus, it's the same co-movements. So what concerns me is that we're seeing this same sort of pattern that we see in normal recessions of people slipping into longer term rates of unemployment. And I guess that kind of makes sense, but maybe what is novel, or maybe the contribution here, is that these patterns are the same as in previous recessions. What that really flags is that if this continues, that is to say, if the post-COVID, if the COVID public health situation does not improve so that the current economic situation does not improve, we would expect to see this continued slippage into longer term unemployment. And those are situations that are consistent with these slow dynamics taking over during the post-COVID recovery. So I know Louise is going to say a few things about looking further ahead, and there's been an awful lot of discussion. What are the implications for productivity growth? What are the implications for labor force participation? Are there major sectoral shifts that we can anticipate? You know, just remember the air travel picture. Are there shifts in the structure of the workplace that are going to have implications? And it reminds me of when I was in graduate school many years ago, I just heard this, it's always stuck with me, of this great economist response. And it's, you know, is productivity, what's going to be happening to productivity growth over the next 20 years? And the answer is, well, it could go up and it could go down and it could stay the same. And that, I think, continues to be the right answer in response to the COVID-19 recession. I think it's just awfully early to even know what the direction of any of these signs actually are at the moment. And the immediate issue for fiscal health of Social Security, and of course for the overall economy, is to do everything we can to try to be on this slightly more optimistic path, so that we're only 4 or 5 percentage points beyond of a GDP gap, as opposed to 8 or 9 percentage points of a GDP gap in a year from now.
We're going to talk through a little bit of the COVID effects on economy, demography, Social Security benefits and financing, but we kind of want to start on slide number 2 here, or actually slide number 3, with really some of the sort of background, some of the nature of the characteristics of COVID-19. Because after all, that's sort of the first order effect here. What is the nature of this virus? We're all familiar, highly communicable. It's transmissible prior to symptoms showing up, even with someone who never shows symptoms. One of the unfortunate things, it's going to have specific implications, near-term and long-term, is the nature of immunity that is acquired. It appears as the moment as though it's much less than 12 months. So therefore, that has direct implications for herd immunity, and also the potential for repeated infections for folks. This is very much yet to be determined. We have, by the way, I should mention, Karen and I and others in our office have talked to Dave Rubin over at CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and Mark Lipsitch at Harvard, the Shan School, about a number of these ideas about the characteristics of the virus. It has been extremely informative. One of the observations is that some of the European experiences indicated that the overall death rate might be, not all that high, 0.4 to 1%, concentrated at higher ages. And one of the major questions is compromise for survivors going on later in life. And the fundamental question we're all facing here in the near term is, will there be a vaccine or therapy, and how effective will that be? So if we flip to slide number 4, our real focus here is probably on deaths, because deaths are, while they're a lagged indicator, they're a relatively pure indicator of what's going on. We all know that reported cases through testing are not only lagged, but they're also unclear. We've heard people saying that the number of cases that are actually reported might be a small fraction of the number of cases that are actually infected in society. So are we looking at something that could be like a worst case scenario, 1918, where come the fall we had dramatic increase because people let down their guard? Or are we looking at something that will be much better in 2020? Will we avert a substantial second wave in the fall? And if so, we may be able to return largely to normal, as I think Jim Stock was sort of indicating, perhaps in next year. If not, then we are facing something that will be much more serious than a 1 year or 2 year sort of drop off in economic activity. And by the way, we pay attention to deaths because deaths would appear to be the driver that really is going to be directing individual and societal response to what's going on. So on the next slide, we can see where we are sort of currently. Jim Stock had a couple of slides on where we are currently. This is a little bit different look, again, focused on the deaths. And one of the things we're all very, very familiar with is the lag in reporting. We're most familiar with that, and think about that in terms of the lag of reporting for people who have been infected. Obviously not until they get tested and it's confirmed will we have counts of the number of people infected. But we have a similar situation with deaths. So I would suggest, back actually in early April, Jill Shansky and Hiram Hiram Beltran-Sanchez over at Illinois and UCLA, and I started looking at some of the numbers from CDC and some of their stuff. And we realized very quickly that if we just looked on the week-by-week death reports, that these were lagged and they were incomplete. The left little graph here, you can see an indication of that. This is focusing on week number 15, the week ending April 10, which was sort of the peak level of deaths that have been reported. And by the way, the CDC numbers that we've been looking at, this is into the FluView panel that CDC has been reporting on Fridays for many, many weeks. Actually, it's gotten delayed after June 26 to being about a week late coming up, but we're hoping it's still consistent data. The data are actually shown for the number of deaths that occurred within a week and not reported in a week. So what we recognized fairly quickly was the number of deaths that were reported within a week, say for week number 15, which is ending April 10, the number that reported as of April 24 were likely to be lower than what actually being occurred. So we started doing some sort of lag analysis by looking at 2-week separation counts that were indicated by CDC for a given week. And by using that lag analysis, we were able to make a projection out in May 1 that the total deaths for that week 15 ending April 10 would actually not be the number that was shown as of that time, about 65,000, more like 80,000. And it turned out this looks like this is a pretty robust approach of looking at this lag analysis, because lo and behold, as time has gone by for that week 15 of 2020, April 10, the number actually looks like it's creeping up towards essentially what we've been estimating on our lag analysis of about 80,000. We've done successive lag analysis, or I have at least, and it looks like the lag analysis is continuing to show an expectation for that week of about 80,000 deaths, and we're sort of climbing up to that. Now, on the right-hand panel, you can see a little bit of what the implications of this are. What we've shown here on the blue and the black lines are what CDC was showing for the various weeks, January all the way out through partially into June of this year, in their reports as of June 26 and July 11. And you can see the June 26 are what they were showing for the number of deaths in these weeks that they had recorded to date, and the blue line. And then for July 11, you can see what they are. But when we apply our lag analysis and make an estimate of what completed deaths are likely to be, and again, on the left panel, you see how effective that appears to be. It looks as though the turnaround in deaths going back up didn't actually occur in July. Yes, it did occur in July in terms of the numbers of reports, but it looks like likely the complete count of actual deaths looks like it actually turned around in June and started going up essentially in the week ending June 12th. So again, the lag is significant here, and it's something we want to pay attention to because we really want to know where the turning points and where changes are really occurring. So if we, on that, let me end with a sort of preliminary stuff and pass the baton over to Karen to talk about some of the economic effects, near term and long term.
Great, thank you, Steve. So before I really get started, I just want to note that I am in a vacation rental right now, and the road noise is a little louder than I would have liked. So hopefully it isn't too distracting to everyone, but just be aware. So first, we just wanted to go through a few economic effects on Social Security. And the main takeaway here, as shown on the slide, is that in the near term, effects will really be largely due to the lower payroll tax we will see, which in turn is due to the reduced employment and GDP. So this is a really nice graph that one of the folks on our team put together. It looks a lot like what Jim Stock showed earlier. A lot of lines here, so let me orient you a little bit. These are real GDP levels in dollars billions. The solid lines are what folks were projecting before COVID. So you will see on here the red line was the fiscal 21 budget, which is always a little more optimistic than the other forecasters. The blue line, which is sort of similar to the purple line, is what was projected in the 2020 trustees report, and that was before any COVID effects. Now, the lower dashed lines are what forecasters are saying now. So obviously a huge drop in Q2 of 2020, and then rising up at various rates going forward. What we've got here are some Moody's, IHS, and CBO. The takeaway here, forecasts are really varying widely, and they're being updated extremely frequently. Sometimes you'll see new forecasts each week. Now, similarly, this is just looking at the ratios of where we were pre-COVID to now. So again, we've got CBO, we've got Moody's, and we've got IHS. A huge drop in Q2 of 2020, rising up relatively quickly for most of them. You'll see that the IHS projection in May actually went above pre-COVID levels, but they've come down a bit since then. The bottom line here, will the GDP levels return to those pre-recession levels, or will we see a permanent loss to future potential GDP, as has been typical in past recessions? Labor force. This really matters for the Social Security program. Labor force flows directly into employment, which flows then directly into the payroll taxes we receive. Again, you can see really varying projections of what's going on here. IHS in June was saying labor force participation rates would be all the way down to 59% and rising back up from there. CBO had a really more gradual path, and Moody's is somewhere in the middle. How severe will these declines be, and will we get back to where we expected to be before the recession? And really, what goes directly into Social Security financing? It's really the earnings and the payroll tax revenue. Similar graph here. Before COVID, things were looking pretty rosy. Lines were going up and up. After you see the drop, and then again, those revenues go up over time. The trends all seem to reach pre-recession levels within the next few quarters, but it looks like we're really going to take a hit on the levels. The forecasters all see lower nominal aggregate earnings. Is that because of lower employment, lower inflation, lower real wage? Really a combination of all three of those factors go into this. So, Social Security payroll tax revenue will almost certainly be lower than we've projected, but by how much? Back in April, we offered a few scenarios that assumed 15% lower earnings in payroll tax for the year 2020. Now it's looking like that might have been a little excessive, maybe 10% seems more likely. Of course, who knows what's going to happen? Will there be a substantial second wave? That could make us a little more pessimistic again. One good piece of news, part of the legislation recently was allowing employers to defer payroll taxes. That does not affect Social Security at all. We get the revenues just like we always would have, no changes there. You may have heard in the news that the president is really interested in a payroll tax cut. Will that happen? Hard to say. Historically, any of those payroll tax cuts have been reimbursed to the trust funds by the general fund of the Treasury. So it's likely that if there is any sort of cut, Social Security would be unaffected by that. And the big question, what will any of these effects be beyond 2020? So now I think I will turn it back over to Steve to go through a few more slides on the demographic side.
Thank you, Karen. Great. So yeah, we've got some demographic slides. Karen and I are going to sort of talk a bit about the mortality, fertility, and immigration. So let's start with the mortality. If we could flip to slide number 13. So this is really just where our baseline is in the latest trustees report. I think we all understand that mortality has tended to drop over time, but since 2009, not so much. Deaths of despair, lots of other things have been happening. One of the important things to keep in mind with mortality is that a decline in mortality at very younger ages, under about 35 or 40, actually is positive for program finances. I'm sorry, yeah, that's right, because more people surviving at those ages. A decline in mortality at higher ages is negative for program finances. Of course, those of us who are over 50 like to see it, but for program finances, that has an effect. So age specific is really important. Now, getting into, well, what's happening under COVID, if we flip to the next slide, we see the big question is how much effect will COVID deaths have? We know they're going to be concentrated at older ages. And the question is, will there be persistent cumulative effects on mortality in the longer term? We know about the direct virus-related immediate deaths. We're counting those. We're getting with a lag, and we're estimating them for completeness also. But increased deaths from COVID at a later point because of cumulative compromises that people are experiencing. There's the other question is, are we also having a miscoding of deaths or deaths from despair and violence, suicide and homicide that are associated with the current pandemic situation? Very serious questions, and at this point, the data are simply unclear. If we flip to the next slide, we have some graphs here of what's been going on. These are again deaths from the CDC FluView basis, and I should mention there that in that data series that is provided weekly by CDC, they show total deaths in the U.S. Then they also split out the pneumonia, influenza, COVID, the PIC deaths separately. And these graphs show you what has been happening over the last several years on a period by period basis over time as we move seasonality. On the left, we see weekly deaths excluding influenza, pneumonia, and COVID. And we can see that typically what has happened is after the 11th week of each year, we tend to see that it drops off a lot. We get past the flu season. Obviously, this year, not the same. And keep in mind, this is deaths excluding pneumonia, influenza, and COVID. The right panel is the implicit numbers that come out of the flu view numbers from CDC, which show what is happening if we look solely at the numbers for influenza, pneumonia, and COVID. The interesting thing on this is, even with our completeness analysis, these numbers for the PIC do not show an increase as we get into June, whereas the numbers excluding pneumonia, influenza, and COVID do show the increase on the red line by our completeness analysis in June. So is this a miscoding issue, or are we really seeing a drop off in deaths due to COVID continuing through June, and it's other reasons? A question to be determined, because we don't really have clarity on what the death counts are with any precision by cause of death. Now, on the next slide, we see this sort of elaborated a little bit more. Here we're showing on these different graphs, the black line is what we have on a completed estimated basis. Again, through this is most of the way through June, because I'm a little bit reluctant to sort of show you numbers that would be taking you into July on the completed basis. The completion analysis is a little bit tricky there. So this is just through most of June. I believe it's June 19. We can see the total deaths are rising up, and the deaths for other than PIC, which is the red line, are also rising up. But the numbers estimated based on the numbers from CDC for PIC are not actually going up in that time. So there is a serious question here as to whether there's not just lag, but also whether there is a coding issue. Are the numbers that are really associated with COVID really being put forth and being recorded by CDC and reported to CDC on a basis that is really consistent? So this is, and others we know, some folks, I think, Dan, I forget his last name, up at Yale's looking at this, looking at sort of total deaths, may be a better indicator of what's really going on here, especially from our point of view, where total deaths is what really matters. The fact that deaths are coming from COVID versus from suicide or anything else all matters in terms of the number of people we have in our population as workers or beneficiaries. So with that, again, let me now pass the baton back to Karen for some of the other demographic issues.
Thanks, Steve. So obviously, mortality is a big factor when it comes to COVID effects. But we do expect some other effects of COVID on other demographic factors that are important to the Social Security program. So one of those is fertility. This graph here is just showing us historically what the total fertility rate has been through time. And the total fertility rate is a measure of the number of births per woman over her full lifetime. So you can see that it was way up in the baby boom, came down precipitously in the 60s and 70s, remained at pretty low levels for a while, rose up, and then now, since the last recession, has been declining quite a bit. The most recent data is about 1.7. I believe that was in 2019. Obviously, some of that was due to the most recent recession. Some of it is likely due to other factors, are women delaying births more and more. So COVID obviously has induced a recession. Will it have similar effects on fertility as other recessions have? Will we expect fertility to go down even further, which changes the age distribution of the population, which is really important to the Social Security program. It's really about the number of workers per beneficiary that's paying for the program. So you can see here, the very tiny alternative tube line is our intermediate projection for the future. So we are assuming that ultimately births will get back up to 1.95 per woman. Will COVID affect that in the near term? We wouldn't really expect any longer term effects from COVID, but it is something we're thinking about. Similarly, immigration, we would expect COVID to have some effect. Although they're extremely speculative at this point. We split things up into two different buckets, basically. Number one is lawful immigration. We're thinking there may be some timing effects due to delayed processing there. Obviously, not as many folks are actually completing their applications, getting them in, getting through the system. But our general thinking at this point is that these folks have been waiting for a long time to immigrate to the US, and they likely won't be deterred. Unauthorized immigration might be a different story. Sometimes people say, well, why do you guys care about unauthorized immigration? We do receive payroll tax revenue from a lot of these workers, whether they make up a social security number or have some other way of getting money into the system. Many of them really are paying taxes. So we do expect border closing to have some effect, really both people coming into the country and leaving the country. Will the recessions deter unauthorized immigration? Historically, in other recessions, immigration has gone down. So we would expect COVID-induced recessions to have similar effects there. An interesting thing we're thinking about some is, will the varying impacts of COVID around the world affect migration patterns? It very well might. Again, it's pretty speculative at this point, but it is something we're thinking about. So moving on to some specific program-specific effects on Social Security. We talked some about economic effects, demographic effects, which are a little broader, but zooming in more on Social Security. One thing you may have heard about, it's been in the press, I think Andrew Biggs first had an article about it a few months ago, is the effects of the average wage index. So the average wage index for 2020 will likely decline, meaning that those who become newly eligible for Social Security benefits in 2022 will have lower benefits. For retired worker benefits, this is anyone who reaches age 62 in 2022, so those who were born in 1960. For disabled workers, it's those who will be newly entitled for benefits in 2022, and also survivors and auxiliary beneficiaries on those accounts as well. So the key here is that the AWI is determined based on the ratio of total wages paid in the year, that's your numerator, to the denominator of the total number of at any time workers in the year. So the wages, the numerator, we expect will be down significantly due to the recession, but the number of anytime workers in the year, we don't expect that to change very much. So overall, we think that ratio will decline significantly just because of the timing and the abrupt drop of employment earlier this year. So one thing I noticed we didn't really put in these slides and probably should have was that the AWI directly affects Social Security benefit calculations. Earnings are indexed to 2 years before your eligibility year. So the AWI in 2020 is the indexing for anyone who's retiring in 2022. So really there are two main effects here, and let me go through these quickly. I know we don't have a huge amount of time, but we can answer questions at the end. The first main effect, we're calling this the notch. So given an illustrative scenario, similar to what we talked about before, total wages for 2020 of about 10% below the level that was projected in last year's trustees report, and the number of workers going down just a little bit, about 1% lower than we projected in the 2020 trustees report. So what does this mean? Under this scenario, about 4 million, actually more than 4 million, retired worker and disabled worker beneficiaries who are newly eligible in 2022 would receive a benefit that's 9.1% lower than expected for life, as would all survivor and auxiliary beneficiaries paid on their accounts. That's about another 1 million. So another way to look at it, not only is it 9.1% lower than they might have expected, it's also 5.9% lower than similar folks who retired the year earlier. So they're actually receiving lower benefits despite the wage indexing of the program than people who retired 1 year earlier. A secondary effect, we're calling this one the boost. So same illustrative scenario, the AWI will increase 9.1% less than expected. This one's a little trickier, but all workers with earnings in 2020 who become eligible after 2022, when their earnings are indexed, those 2020 earnings will be indexed 10% higher than they would have otherwise. So that 1 year of earnings will kind of get a boost. Because that increases for only 1 year of their earnings out of normally the 35 used in the average index monthly earnings, the increase will be relatively small. It will be generally less than 0.3%, averaging, we think, about 0.15%. So while the effect is small for an individual, it affects a lot of individuals. It's anyone who becomes eligible after 22. So, for example, me, I would get this benefit. So, what are lawmakers doing about this? One thing to know is that these effects won't really be seen until 2022. So there may not be a huge rush to get this addressed, but I think lawmakers are thinking, there's all this COVID legislation out there now, why not get it addressed now while people are thinking about it? So there are 2 bills out there right now that will address this. S 4180, the Protecting Benefits for Retirees Act, that was introduced on July 2nd by Senators Tim Kaine and Bill Cassidy. And that does not let the AWI decrease from 1 year to the next. And it addresses both the notch and the boost. So both of those will be taken care of. Another bill was HR 7499 that was introduced on July 9th by Representative John Larson. Again, it doesn't let the AWI decrease from 1 year to the next, but in this case, the legislation specifically only addresses the notch. The boost remains in place. There are also a few other items in this legislation that will raise benefits for just the 1 year, 2020, and they're very similar to what is in Representative Larson's comprehensive Social Security bill. That's the Social Security 2100 Act. A little advertisement at the bottom of this slide. We did provide an analysis to Representative Larson, and you can find that on our website. Okay, moving on. What do we see will be the effects on the numbers of beneficiaries? So focusing on the retirement side, the OASI program, there's been a lot of speculation in the press and elsewhere that the recession will cause workers to apply for retirement benefits earlier than they would have otherwise. We have seen that some in past recessions. We've been looking at the data very closely. Mike Stevens in our office has got his finger on the pulse there. We're actually not seeing that in the data yet. Speculation is folks are relying on extended unemployment benefits for now, and maybe later, if the recession persists, then they will apply for the retirement benefits. We do know that some of those extended unemployment benefits are expiring at the end of this month. I think the $600 extra that folks are getting, if that isn't changed by legislation soon. Increases in survivor benefits will likely be pretty limited here. One interesting point is that earlier benefit start for those who have age-reduced benefits actually tends to lower longer-term costs by a little bit. So what about on the DI side? Again, so far we aren't really seeing any evidence of the increased DI applications. That may happen in the future, but we're not seeing it yet. One thing we're just showing here on this graph is what happened in the last recession. So you can see in 2007, 2008, we were getting about 1.5 million disability worker applications a year. that jumped up extremely quickly in the last recession, up to 1.8 million in 2009, 1.9 million in 2010. It did come back down even a lot more precipitously than we expected. You can see each one of these lines is what we projected in each successive trustees report. We didn't do a great job of predicting this extreme downturn. So it's an interesting graph that we'd like to show. So what will happen in this recession? If it extends, we would expect to see some sort of jump. So putting it all together, there will clearly be competing effects on the size of the beneficiary population in the near term. There will be a decrease in beneficiaries due to the increased deaths. There will be increases in beneficiaries if we get additional retirement and disability applications, assuming the recession persists and recovery isn't abrupt. Just for example, if there are an additional 200,000 to 300,000 DI applications, and about 1/2 of those are allowed, which is about the average, will that be on the order of the number of additional deaths we see in 2020? Will it kind of even out? Or could there be even more beneficiary deaths in 2021? Again, tons of uncertainty. As everyone seems to be saying, we keep saying we hope we'll know more in a couple of months, but it seems like the further down the road we go, the more uncertainty there is.
You can see bottom line, what's going to happen to the trust funds under this. You can see this is our projection under the 2020 trustees report of what will happen to the cost of the program and where we will reach reserve depletion out in 2035, at which point we wouldn't be able to pay full benefits. That was under a not taking into account COVID baseline. So what are we looking at under the potential for COVID? Well, first of all, let's take a quick look on the next slide. I know that Jim Stock earlier mentioned about the last recession. Many other folks, including those at Bipartisan Policy Center and others, have said, hey, maybe this recession is going to be just like the Great Recession. Well, I think there's some real differences and we ought to be cognizant of that. This is not an economic recession of the type that we've seen most often in the past. You can see in the Great Recession here, where, and as with most recessions, the real driver of the impacts on Social Security is the drop in revenue, far more so than any effect on beneficiaries and benefit amounts. And you can see, though, that in the last recession, which started at the end of 2007, we had only a very gradual movement towards less revenue than had been expected. This is comparing what actually occurred relative to our 2008 trustees report, which anticipated none of that recession. You can see it took 2, 3, 4 years for the revenue to really drop off as unemployment rates, and the depth of the recession was gradual. This recession is so dramatically different. It happened in a heartbeat. And so there is that possibility that if we get that wonderful vaccine that we're all hoping for, that maybe we could come back, maybe not as precipitously, but perhaps almost as precipitously. And you can see also that the persistent effects all the way through 2014 in terms of the reduction relative to expectation in constant dollar revenue was quite dramatic under the last recession. Well, we have that under this. So bottom line, on our next slide, we back in April, right after our trustees report came out, talking with the folks at Bipartisan Policy Center, we speculated at that time, based on what we'd seen to date, that we might have for the year as a whole, 2020, something like 15% less earnings and less taxable earnings and less revenue coming into the program. If that would have persisted for 1 year, we were estimating that that would change our combined trust fund reserve depletion date from early in 2035 to mid 2034. That's assuming that in 2021, we would basically come back with full recovery. If in fact we had 2 years or a little bit more than 2 years of a 15% reduction in revenue relative to 2020 trustees report expectation, and then came back in 2022, we were expecting that we might move to early 2034 or maybe late in 2033 for the reserve depletion. Now, more recently, and as of a hearing we had last week, and Jim Stock made this point that actually the economic recovery to date was looking like it was better than had been expected back in April. So then we were assuming the possibility of maybe only a 10% drop relative to expectation in aggregate wages and earnings during the year. And if it were no worse than that, then we might end up with our reserve depletion date advancing Again, maybe only a half a year into mid 2034. However, the huge question is what is going to happen beyond that. So if we flip to the next slide, which is actually our last slide, glad to tell you this. If instead closure from the pandemic extends through 2021, and in fact, which would be contingent upon having a second wave in the fall, and if we have a permanent reduction in the level of economic activity, which Jim was referring to and Karen was referring to earlier, then we could have much more substantial negative effects. The Great Recession obviously advanced our reserve depletion date by about 6 years. Such could happen again if we take a hit in terms of economic activity from which we do not recover anytime soon. So reserve depletion date, it's up in the air. I much appreciated Jim Stock's earlier panel, which showed the breadth of a stochastic expectation for the future. And the screen is not tall enough to really show that here because we've never seen such uncertainty. And with that, let me sort of stop here because we want to get Louise.
Knowing the panel that I was on with Jim, who's been following every daily movement in the data, and Karen and Steve, who know exactly how this all works for Social Security, I thought I'd go a little bit big picture. Let's see, how do I? So what I'm going to talk about today is what drives economic assumptions usually, and how should COVID change that? And as Jim said, Poterba said, I was a member of the last technical panel, and so I'm sort of coming at it from that perspective. Everything I say today should not be intended as any kind of criticism of Steve or Karen. I learned so much from them, and they're so thoughtful about this. So I just want to give my view, though. So how does COVID affect my views on some of the assumptions? I'm just going to talk about a few of them. And then I'm going to move it away from just the Social Security projections to think about what the implications of COVID might be for Social Security policy, which is not Karen and Steve's bailiwick, but I thought I would include it. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is sort of how the projections are framed. So they're basically done with two sets. You have a near-term set, that's the first 10 years, and a long-term set, that's the last 65 years. When we talk about these projections, we'll say they're 75-year projections, and so you should really use long-run historical averages as a guide to the long-run assumptions. What that means in general is that the first few years are going to kind of reflect current data, but then you're going to have to transition to the long-run values. So most of the first 10 years really are a function of the gap between current values and long-run values. And that, to my mind, means that the long-run assumptions kind of drive the projections. And then I want to ask, is the long run really important? A lot of people will say, and I sort of agree, that the long run isn't that important because we don't know anything about it. But I don't even want to talk about that right now. I think that when you think about why we care about these numbers, from a policy and a political perspective, the really important numbers are for the next 10 and 15 years. Right? The demographic transition, we're a third of the way through, it's over by 2035. The HI trust fund is depleting within 6 years, OSDI by 2035 pre-COVID. So getting the next 10 to 15 years right is really what the projection should all be all about. So how does this relate to COVID? Well, I think COVID could easily affect the next 10 years, but it's not very likely to have large long-run effects. So if we're going to continue doing projections where we're sort of gearing towards a long-run value and we don't change the long-run value very much, we might miss the COVID effects. I'm not saying they will. I'm sure they're thinking very carefully about it, but I just think it's something to remember. Let me give you an example of what I mean. So one of the things is that SSA predicts is the labor share. So this is the compensation share as a share of GDP. We know it declined through the early 80s, and it was generally, not every year, but generally well below the 1947 to 2018 average since. There are various explanations for the decline. I think we can over-explain the decline in the labor share with globalization, higher depreciation, higher housing share, decline in worker power. These explanations, not sure which ones are exactly right and how they sort of work together, but they're all kind of likely to persist at least for a while. So if you ask me what my best guess of the labor share over the next 10 to 15 years is, it would look kind of like the labor share today. But SSA says over the long run, we're going to get back to the long run average. And so you can see they have these sharp increases over the next 10 years so that they're back to the long run average by the end of it. So I think that's kind of a problem. And then when I think about COVID on top of it, I agree with Jim, it's too early to know how anything is going to work out. But right now, when I look at the level of the stock market and the level of unemployment, it sure looks like that the labor share is going to stay low for longer. So that's just, okay. Let's look at productivity growth. So we've had very weak productivity growth over the past decade. The trustees assume it rises back to the long run average almost over the next 5 years. I thought this seemed optimistic before. Could happen, but there's not much weight on sort of the secular stagnation hypothesis or something structural like productivity related to aging, lack of competition. And then when we think about what effect COVID will have on productivity, I'd argue in the long run, probably nothing. Maybe there'll be some reduction from, like, we recognize now that we can have pandemics, and so we need to have sort of a little bit more preparation, which might be costly. But I think over the next 10 to 15 years, again, speculative, I agree, the effects could be substantial. If we have a lot of business closures, then a large cost to start up again. We have job losses, if they're permanent, which some of them will clearly are. It means we're going to have to find new labor matches. The quality of labor matches are likely to suffer. Firm-specific human capital is going to be lost. And then another question is this prolonged period of lockdowns and working from home and uncertainty about the future, what is in itself doing to innovation, right? If we sort of believe people all working together in the same offices is kind of really important for innovation, you just wonder whether or not we're sort of losing some undefined, year and a half where innovation is going to be held down. So again, when I think about what's going to happen to productivity, I would really want to focus on the next 10 to 15 years and not care so much about getting back to a long run average. Finally, let me talk about interest rates. So that's something nobody's mentioned. So real interest rates have been declining for decades. They averaged just a 0.5 percentage point real from 2010 to 2019. Aging, rising inequality, low productivity are likely contributors. Again, things that many people think are going to persist, and the interest rates will probably remain low for long. The trustees actually did lower their interest rate recently to 2.3%, which I think is a reasonable long run assumption. But again, they get there very rapidly. And so interest rates are going up quite rapidly over the next 10 years or 5 years even. And I think that seems unlikely. And then one of the biggest things that's happened since COVID is that interest rates have fallen even more sharply. I show here what the July 2020 interest rate on the Social Security special treasury is. It's dropped 1.25 percentage points since January. That's the nominal rate. I think the real has probably dropped a little bit less. And so this possibility of low interest rates for a really long time seems even more likely than it did before. And importantly, the probability that the interest rate is less than the growth rate of the economy, R less than G, was high before, I think, and higher now, right? And if you think that this might be a long run recession, there might be a lot more saving, you just have to worry about this persisting. So what are the implications now of COVID for Social Security policy? And I'll come back to the R less than G. Action to address imbalances in Social Security and increases in the federal deficit, we all know the long run projections, we will need to do those eventually, most likely. I think COVID has probably sped up the date of reserve depletion and likely increased the changes required to address the long run imbalances, particularly because of the lower interest rate. That doesn't necessarily mean that we should act sooner rather than later because of COVID, okay? And I have sort of two reasons. One, thinking about ensuring the economic recovery is complete. And two, I'm gonna go back to the R less than G. Okay, so ensuring the full economic recovery. So under the current law, without any additional stimulus dollars, which we're likely to get, but also no second wave and also pretty optimistic numbers about the control of the virus, CBO projects GDP won't be back to pre-COVID baseline for like almost a decade, right? So in my view, the main goal of fiscal policy should be to get back to the hot labor market that we had right before the pandemic. Hot labor markets are incredibly helpful for low-income working age households. They lead to both higher GDP and lower inequality. And I think one of the things that we learned with the hot labor market was potential GDP was bigger than we thought. But, I worry with debt to GDP projected in the CBO baseline, again, without additional stimulus, to hit 108% by 2021. And with reserve depletion looming for Medicare and Social Security, I think there will be tremendous political pressure to cut spending and raise taxes. And I think anything that sort of is aimed at debt reduction or putting Social Security back on a footing over the long run before we are back to that strong economy is self-defeating for long-run economic and Social Security health. So from that perspective, the COVID economy, in my view, should lead action on Social Security to be later rather than sooner, unless the action is just about either transferring general revenues or announcement of plans far in the future that's not going to affect anybody's spending behavior. Now let's talk about the implications of R less than G. So another reason is often mentioned for acting sooner rather than later is because delay imposes costs on future generations. And that's the way we've always talked about it. So from the 2020 trustees report, if substantial actions are deferred for several years, the changes necessary to maintain Social Security solvency would be concentrated on fewer years and fewer generations. Significantly larger changes would be necessary if action is deferred until the combined trust fund reserves become depleted in 2035. So the truth is, if R is less than G over the long run, everyone's actually better off if we allow those reserves to exhaust and just run a pay-as-you-go scheme. So I'm just going to show that with a very simple simulation using two interest rates, which I call high and low, and I can compare act now and require reserves at the end of simulation to cover costs for 1 year. That's basically the long run Social Security stability condition, or deplete the reserves and then just run a pay-as-you-go scheme, okay? I'm going to use SSA GDP, income and costs, and the average nominal GDP growth is about 4% over the long run for SSA. My high nominal interest rate is 4.7%, which is the SSA long run, and my low nominal interest rate is 1%, which, as I said, is a little bit higher than what we're seeing now. It's a very low one. So this is just illustrative. I'm not saying this is what's going to happen, but I just think that we need to consider the implications if it does happen. So here's the experiments. If you look the top right corner, I'm just going to explain what the experiment is. This is the ratio of trust fund to the costs. And so what I call 1 year is this situation where we raise contributions just enough so that by the end of 75 years, we have 1 year's worth of costs in the trust fund. And the pay-go says, do what you're doing now, don't do anything different until it depletes. And when the reserves deplete, go pay-go. Okay, so you have no trust fund. Okay, so if you look on the left, at the top left, this is what happens with high interest rates. So, and this is the contribution change that you have to make relative to current law for these different stabilization exercises as a share of GDP, not payroll. So what I call the 1 year, you see that you have to raise contributions by a little bit more than 1% of payroll for different horizon. For pay-go, you do nothing until assets reserves deplete. And then you have to do more in order to be stable. You have to go to a pay-go, which sort of stabilizes at 1.5% of GDP in the long run. So this is a classic trade-off. Earlier generations pay less, later generations pay more. Okay, now let's look at what happens if you have R less than G, and I do less because I have, this is kind of a big R is way less than G here. But here you can see it's turned exactly on its head. So you have to do about 1.5% of GDP starting now if you try to do this long run stability with 1 year of assets at the end. But if you go pay-go, you do nothing now, and then you have to do less, and eventually you end up having to do just a little bit less. Why is that? Well, we're in a world where debt is less than free, which means assets are costly, right? The rate of return on your assets are not enough to keep those assets equal to 1 year of cost, and so you have to take some of your contributions just to maintain those assets. And so I'm not saying, with R less than G, we should just keep borrowing forever. We shouldn't pay any taxes. So obviously R less than G forever is not something that we can count on, or that we, can even sort of understand how to think long-term about. But I do think the fact that it's pretty likely that R will be less than G for a long time, especially with current expectations on interest rates. And we have to, and I think that at least makes you say the problem is not as urgent as you might think, and the benefits of acting sooner are not what you might have once thought. And I just think it needs to get into this conversation.
It has been the case in every recession we've had for the last, 50, 60 years, that essentially there's been unit root behavior. So there's essentially been a step down in the level of GDP, and the path has been permanently lower. So it could be that this time is different. Of course, this time could be different. And there are a lot of things that are really different about it now. But I think betting against the historical correlations, especially if we stay in this current muddle for another 8 months, is not something I would want to do.
That would suggest, therefore, that we should probably have a lower trajectory for expected GDP and productivity growth in general in the future, given that we have not outlawed the business cycle yet. So if we're going to have repeated economic recessions from time to time, that would suggest, and if each one of them is going to lop off something from our potential, then we should have a much lower gradient on potential growth in the future. And that's certainly something to consider. To Louise's point, I would just want to mention, first of all, that Louise, you did point out a number of assumptions which you obviously disagree with, all of which I believe are ones where you're saying the trustees' assumptions are too optimistic. You didn't point out the disability incidence rates, which are assumed to rise back up very quickly, or mortality improvement, which is assumed to rise back up very quickly also, and sort of go in the other direction just by way of balance. The other thing I would just comment on that, by the way, Louise, also is please keep in mind that the trustees report by law is supposed to speak to the actual status of the trust funds. It's not supposed to be an economic forecast or near term. It's supposed to speak to the actual status of the programs, where policymakers have tended to want to sort of know what it's looking like, it's going to look like over the long term. And a final little comment too also, and here's hyper speculation, innovation. I think we've all heard, all of us, I believe, are dealing from our homes. Some of us have a beautiful background of a wooded setting, and others have a bookcase like Jim has. We have two Jims at polar opposites on this. But I think there's been a lot of discussion about many businesses now are kind of getting used to the idea that people working at home and having less infrastructure space is potentially a model in some cases for the future. Will that be greater efficiency, less efficiency? I don't know about y'all, but I think in Karen, in my office, people have been actually working more hours than before. No commuting time, the bars are closed, at least here in Maryland. So is innovation really going to take a hit? Or is it possible that it could go the other way? I'm not saying we're banking on that. I'm just saying that while economics is indeed the dismal science, not everything always need necessarily be dismal.
So maybe I'm just can't resist jumping in for a second, Steve. We actually did a panel last week on innovation and COVID at the Summer Institute, and had people who were from places like the Genelia Farms, Howard Hughes Medical Institute Research Lab, and NIH. I think the general sense, and it's also, I think, borne out by the experience of Summer Institute in the last 2.5 weeks, is that the thing that is taking the greatest hit in this crisis for scientific interaction is the informal and sort of spontaneous discussion of new ideas, new projects that people are doing pretty well at managing to keep their current projects going and moving them on to completion. But that the startup process for new things is the more open-ended question on how we're doing. So the Q&A box, we have Olivia Mitchell's asking a question about saying in the UK, the estimates indicate apparently a 5% saving on Social Security payouts as a result of COVID. And do we have any related numbers for the US? I think that probably is for Karen or for Steve to say something.
So go ahead, Steve. I was just going to say, I think we feel like it's really too soon to tell. We're still learning more. I don't think we could say anything like a 5% saving at this point.
Yeah.
Well, Olivia, I think you should be unmuted if you want to jump in.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously speculative. And the other question is how, to the extent that higher mortality is concentrated among the older population, how many years of less life will it take before it can make a 5% difference?
That would, well, so Olivia, if on average people in retirement are living about 20 years, that would be simply lopping 1 year off of their lifespan after they reach retirement. That'd be about a 5%. However, we have lots of things going on here. I mean, it could be more or less than that as we move through time. Right now, we're seeing obviously some increase in mortality, but we're not expecting to see 5% death amongst our beneficiary population. 5% death amongst our 60 million population would be a lot. And we're not expecting necessarily to see that. On the other hand, in terms of cost of Social Security, there's speculation that we may have more people being compromised in the near term, suffering insults, and therefore perhaps coming to us for disability, as occurred in a big way in the last recession. We are not seeing that as yet. Again, as Karen mentioned before, probably largely because of the extended unemployment and CARES payments. If those come to an end before we have a strong recovery in the economy, Might we see a surge in disability? We might see some surge in disability like we did last time. But if that's the case, we would probably expect that not to be persistent, as what occurred in the last economic recession was not persistent. So 5%, what, reduction in overall costs? That sounds like a lot. And I'm sure that Louise would add in, well, so we'll probably see even a greater reduction than that in terms of revenue.